Fear is an incredibly powerful emotion, but it is rarely one that inspires cogent and considered policy. And that is no less true in the circumstances of Australia's security policy. In the aftermath of World War II, Australia was overwhelmed with a fear that invasion was coming, that we must populate or perish, that we must engage in forward defense, that domino theory was inevitable and the Red Menace would soon be at our doors if we did not take every step to ensure that it did not. That is precisely why it is that Australia formed alliance with the US. They were terrified that, having been abandoned in World War II by Britain, they needed a strong protector and that no cost was too great to ensure that the United States was on side. That is why, in order to get the ANZUS Treaty signed, we committed to following the US into any war that they wished to engage in. That's why we committed to high defense spending and to the loss of lives across numerous conflicts. But with the benefit of hindsight, it's clear that that was not a necessary choice and it was not a wise one, which is why we're incredibly proud to regret that alliance. So, firstly, what would the counterfactual look like in this world, and then an explanation about a series of benefits that would arise in the counterfactual. Firstly, what does that counterfactual look like? We think probably we'd have taken a more neutral and trade-focused position during the Cold War. And notably, this would not be a position Australia would be pursuing on its own. It's one pursued by countries such as Austria, Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, and Norway, which also explains why this would be very plausible for Australia to realistically achieve. These other countries were also relatively rich Western countries. They chose not to follow the US into the Cold War, and they were all the better for it, which explains also why the US would likely let it happen. They have a limited capacity to prevent it, considering our geographic distance. There's relatively little of importance in the Southern Hemisphere that the US would desperately need to contest, and their capacity to do so is limited, which is why they were unable to prevent any of these other far closer, far more countries from engaging in that particular policy. Similarly, we would obviously still maintain friendly relationships with the US and other Western countries. We'd engage in trade with them. We would not form military alliances, and that would free us up to, for example, engage in friendly alliances with other countries that were part of, for example, the Warsaw Pact, or countries in Asia that happen to have socialist regimes that we otherwise would not have engaged in. So then, what are the benefits of this policy? They're threefold. Firstly, on defense, then on trade, and then on benefits to the rest of the world. Let's start with the question of defense, because that was the motivator for this policy. But it is clear that our defense was in no way benefited by engaging in it. The first thing to note is that there was never any real threat to Australia's sovereignty. None of the countries around us were ever powerful enough to meaningfully challenge our security, and Australia is capable of maintaining a sufficiently large defense force to be able to defend ourselves. While it is true that communism spread throughout many parts of Asia, none of these countries displayed any desire to invade Australia or ever had any capacity to do so. So it is unclear that there was any imperative to need to worry in the first place. But there were substantial costs. Firstly, a large number of Australian lives were lost in the Malayan Emergency, in the Korean War, in Vietnam, in the First and Second Gulf Wars, and in Afghanistan. Those are conflicts we need not participate in. Secondly, it was financially costly to engage in the alliance with the US. It forced us, for example, to spend far more on defense spending than we otherwise would have, both directly in the fact that we had to participate in conflicts, and war tends to be relatively expensive, both because people die, you need to spend on munitions, logistics, transport, but also because it takes people who could have been engaged in productive economic activity and puts them into a war zone, but also because generally we spent far more money on defense than we otherwise would. And notably, it meant that we spent, for example, US weapons to maintain that alliance at the expense of often cheaper and superior options that we otherwise might have been able to engage in. But finally, it also threatened Australia's security in meaningful ways. It was very unlikely that anyone would bear us any ill will, but for the fact that we engaged in, for example, the invasion of Afghanistan and militarism in the Middle East. It's far less likely that terrorists would have attempted to attack Australia, as, for example, a number have, if it were the case that we were entirely uninvolved in that conflict in the first place. Similarly, we are far more likely to face the risk of, for example, nuclear war when we host US bases and when we're seen as important to US strategic positioning than in a world in which we're a neutral country that no one had any reason to oppose. So Australia's defense is clearly far worse on the side of the status quo than it would be counterfactually. But secondly, why is trade likely to be better? The first reason is that we would have better relationships with a large number of countries in this world. That is to say that our participation in conflict in the Middle East and in Asia meant that there are many countries that we were on negative terms with that we would otherwise be on friendly terms with, would be far more willing to engage with us diplomatically and trade with us in our world than in the status quo. But it also just means that many socialist regimes that we participated in sanctioning or tariffing, we would otherwise have been able to engage in trade with. It probably meant normalization of relationships with countries like China far sooner, and that meant, for example, far more free trade. But secondly, it just means that we would have had far more money to be able to spend on economic development because it was not being spent on pursuing military objectives. That could mean, for example, we'd be able to lower taxes because we'd had reduced outlays, and that would attract more foreign direct investment, and more rich people would have moved to Australia and otherwise participated in the economy than happened to be the case in the status quo. That would be good for Australia's economic prosperity. But notably, considering that this is a debate that takes place over the last 80 years, that is a set of benefits that would compound over time. Even if we achieved 1% additional GDP growth per year, that would lead to an Australia that is several times richer today than it otherwise would have been, which is an incredibly important benefit. Finally, though, there would be benefits to the rest of the world as well. Firstly, for the reason that the first two benefits I've established for Australia are not zero-sum, the benefits to Australia are also benefits to the world. A richer Australia gets richer by engaging in trade, but also a richer Australia is a better force for example, providing foreign aid or assisting other countries in diplomatic efforts. But also, an Australia that participates in less conflict overseas is an Australia that is also killing fewer people overseas, benefiting those people. But secondly, it is likely that Australia would have been an active force for good. If Australia chose not to participate in the Cold War and not to engage with the US, it is very likely we'd bring other countries with us too. New Zealand, which relies entirely on us for defense, would likely also choose not to engage with the US, noting, for example, that they've often had a much weaker relationship with the US than we have had. They refuse to host nuclear submarines in New Zealand, for example. They'd probably come along with us. As would, for example, Pacific Island countries, to whom we are the largest trading partner and the biggest source of foreign aid. That means, for example, less diplomatic cover and clout for the US in the UN, and when it engages in the worst excesses of its activities in the Cold War, deposing democratically elected regimes, such as in Chile, or backing dictatorships or other regimes, such as the Shah in Iran. All of which means that the US likely engages in fewer of its worst excesses of policy, and we'd be able to shape the overall diplomatic community in a way that was far more democratic and far more fair to all countries. At the end of this debate, we needn't have engaged with the United States. We did so at great cost, and we gave up much that would have been incredibly valuable had we not.